Okay. Okay, so we're doing color today and talking about the color wheel. And I sent you all a handout last week that I hope you printed out. It was a black and white chart. I taped it down to a couple different boards because I do many at once. So if you don't get it the first time, you'll get it the second time. So what I have today are our three primary colors, and all colors are made from blue, red, and yellow. Those are our primaries. Now, there are different shades of blue. So I picked primary blue, primary red, and cadmium yellow, even though I have many other blues from which to choose. If you only have one blue, use it. I don't care if it's phthalo blue, cobalt blue, whatever it is. If you only got one blue, let's use it. Same thing for the red and the yellow. Use whatever you have. If you have a choice of blues, like if you have many tubes in your stash, try and see the one that is closest to a primary blue or a cyan or an ultramarine blue or a cobalt blue, but I wouldn't use a teal because it's got a lot of yellow in it. We're trying to get the pure red, like a cadmium red, a primary red. An alizarin crimson is too maroon for our purposes here, but if it's the only red you've got, then let's use it. I'm using all heavy body paints from tubes. And for this exercise, I'm trying to squeeze out my my old tubes where I only have one squeeze left. I'm trying to use them up because I have a rolling cart and each drawer is a color. So I'm trying to go from, like 22 tubes of yellow to maybe 20 tubes of yellow. So what we're going to do first is place where we see this triangle with the solid line, the triangle with the solid line. It's got 3 points, the 3 circles that it connects. So I'm going to take a pencil and up here in our top circle, I'm going to put a B for blue. And I'm going to pencil in a red down here, an R for red, and a yellow here just for yellow. So we have our triad of blue, red, yellow that we're going to start with. Now, because we will be mixing colors and changing colors, you want to have a cup of water, you want to have a rag, you want to have a piece of scrap paper, you want to have maybe a couple brushes. If you only have one brush to your name, that's fine. You'll be rinsing it out a lot. So I'm going to squeeze out on my palette, and I have one of these weld palettes that has a little well, so that even if the paint gets wet, it won't slide off the paper like it would if I was using that waxy palette paper that's really good for thick, heavy body paints. But today, my paint might be getting wet, so I think I want something with a well. So the blue is going to go at the top, so I'm just going to squeeze out a dollop of blue in one of the wells, and I'm going to position my palette so it kind of matches up with our finish, where we want our things to be. So I've got my blue up at the noon spot. I'm going to put a squeeze of red, set it down to do that, in the 8 o'clock spot. And I'm not squeezing out gobs and gobs. I'm just squeezing out, like how much you might put on your toothpaste, toothbrush, if this were toothpaste. And then I'm also going to squeeze out a yellow in the 4 o'clock spot. Now, I'll tell you right now that you're probably going to need more yellow than the other colors. So there's my blue at noon, my red at 8 o'clock, and my yellow at 4 o'clock. Among the 3 primary colors, yellow is considered to be the weakest, so to speak, and the most transparent of the three. What I mean by that is if we mix red and yellow together, which we will do and going forward, if you mixed equal parts of red with equal parts of yellow, you're going to come up with an orangey red. The red is stronger than the yellow. So in order to get a color, an orange color that looks like it's somewhere between red and yellow, you're going to need more yellow to achieve those results because it's a weaker color, so to speak. So what I also want you to think about also is a piece of scrap paper, because if you've taken my classes before, you know how it breaks my heart to rinse paint down the sink or to throw it away. If you find you have to take a break and you have a palette, you can put acrylic paint in the freezer and it will suspend in the freezer and it will not dry out. Just take it out, and I don't cover it or anything. I just put it in the freezer. You take it out about 10 minutes before you want to use it again and mix it up with maybe a popsicle stick or a paint knife or something just to make it creamy again. Because once it dries on your palette, you cannot bring it back to life like you can with watercolor. And it will not stay alive on your palette as long as oil paints will. Oil paints take days to dry and weeks to dry. So you might want to have a rag at the handy, but what I like to do is have a piece of scrap paper just to wipe my brush off with, because what we're doing essentially is, and I'm going to demonstrate it now, I'm going to wet my brush. And you might have to change your water often. And I am just with a pure blue. Now you may have heard words like shades and tints. A tint is when you add white to a color. So if I added white to this blue, I get a baby blue. If a shade is when you add black to a color and it darkens it. So if I added black to this primary blue, I might get a navy blue or a midnight blue. So I'm just going to fill in, and you don't have to stay in the lines. You can be as messy as you want, but I'm just going to start off at the top at my noon circle and just do the blue straight from the tube, straight from the tube. And I'm going to work two at a time. And I don't care if I go outside the lines. This is just for practice. So you're just going to fill in your circle with the blue. And now I have all this paint on my brush. I'm just going to wipe it off on a piece of scrap paper and make like an intuitive mark, make a swipe. And get that paint off my brush, because we now are working by doing this and erasing or getting the paint off our brush. We're starting a small abstract painting with just by cleaning our brush, and which can move into, let me show you some examples of how you can turn it into like a fun little scrap, turn it into something. These are just marks that I've made with leftover paint, wiping it off my brush and doing it with over and over and over again and using extra paint just to create an extra little painting on the side, because I don't really want to be wiping all that good paint off on my rag if I can wipe it off on a piece of paper and start another painting at the time. And when you think about it, you've got both parts of your art brain working now, because you're doing something very precise and scientific, like we are with this color wheel. And then to clean off your brush, you're flipping over to an intuitive painter who's not thinking about the science, who's not thinking about the end product, and just wiping your brush on a piece of paper, making random arbitrary strokes. And you're going to wind up with two pieces of artwork that are totally different. So now I wiped off my blue, and now I'm going to dip it in the red. And I'm going to fill in my circle at 8 o'clock with red down here. Now this red, this primary red, is looking kind of, when it came out of the tube, it looked much darker. Here on the paper, it's almost looking like a magenta, which is interesting. You know, like when you get, when you're dealing with your printer, if you have a color printer and you've got CMYK inks, you've got cyan and magenta and yellow. This looks more like a magenta. It's not a bloody red, even though it's called primary red. As you can see, it's kind of pinky, which is fine. So that's our red color. And I'm going to wipe off my brush by going in a different direction, maybe perpendicular to my other strokes. And when we make strokes, I am going to do a stroke session. You'll see that when the pigment is fading off of the brush, that's what we call a dry brush stroke, where it's not super saturated and juicy and makes a fluid stroke. You can actually see the paper and the texture of the paper beneath the brush stroke. So now I wash that off, and you want to make sure your brush is super clean because we're going to be dipping it in yellow now. And the yellow, as I mentioned, is the weakest color and the most transparent. And it's easy to get your paint colors adulterated by accidentally dipping your brush into the yellow paint if it still has blue on it or still has red on it. So that's why we want to clean our brushes pretty well. So now we've established our triad. You know, that was easy. And I'm going to wipe my brush off again. And this yellow, you can see now that I go over the blue, the yellow is very transparent. This cadmium yellow, I can see the stroke underneath it. And now that I've layered the yellow over the blue, it's giving me a green, which segues us into, now you want, if you have a separate brush or two brushes, what we want to do is go to the dotted line, the dotted triangle now on our color wheel, which is the hyphenated line, like it's 6 o'clock, 10 o'clock, and 2 o'clock areas. And those are now our secondary colors. We've got our primaries, blue, red, and yellow. Now we're going to create our secondary colors. And this is where you want to eyeball it, because equal parts of blue and green, equal parts of blue and yellow will not make a Kelly green. It'll be more blue because blue is a stronger color than the yellow. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take just a little bit of the blue for now. Better to do too little than too much. You can always add more to it later. Wipe my brush off on my scrap paper and then run it through the water so it's nice and clean. And I have a couple different water cups here when one gets too muddy. Now I'm going to pick up some yellow and a healthy dollop of yellow and start mixing it into the blue to see what kind of green I'm going to get. And I'm seeing it turn green before my eyes. And this is, even though I used more yellow than blue. You can see it's a very dark green. I'm going to have to add even more yellow to it because you might need 2 parts of yellow for every part of blue. This now is a little too dark for me. This is like a really dark forest green. I'm going to show you, bring this up. That's really dark. I think I want to add a little bit more yellow to it. And make sure you got a clean brush before you start dipping in the paint. So now I'm going to add another dollop of yellow to this pool. And now I'm getting more of a, like a Kelly green, a verdant color. Say more like a, something that you might see on the trees outside. So then between on the 2 o'clock bubble between blue and yellow, I am now going to paint my green circle. And I must have done this exercise 100 times, if not more, in my life. I still love doing it. And it's fun if you've got different greens and yellows. You can make different charts. Now, there are warm colors and there are cool colors. I will send a link on that explanation. It's not something that I want to spend a whole hour talking about the difference between warm colors and blue colors, but basically your warm colors have more yellows and reds in them, and your cool colors have more blues. So even though there are warm reds and cool reds, it's really looking at different reds and studying them that you'll learn how to assess whether it's warm or cool. But I don't want to spend the whole time talking about that now. I just want you to use whatever red, blue, and green you have at your disposal. And if you've got a warm red and you've got a cool blue, well, that's okay. It'll work just the same. I want to keep this on an elementary level. I don't want to get into like PhD color theory and lose you in the process. There is so much science behind art, and I've been a lifelong artist. And when I was a much younger artist, I thought that so much of art was intuitive and very free spirit. The more I learn about art, the more that there's so much about it that is science-based. Newton is the one who is attributed, Sir Isaac Newton, with breaking down the colors. And when hundreds of years ago, when these scientists were using things like prisms and glass lenses, they were able to refract the light and break it down into a rainbow. And it was all very scientific. However, many people at the time were frightened by it. The common people, mostly people who were uneducated and more superstitious, they thought that it was like trickery and it being in cahoots with the devil. If you saw the movie Girl with a Pearl Earring, when Vermeer shows Scarlett Johansson the camera obscura, and that's where it projected an image, like they have drawing devices like a Lucy where it can, through lenses and mirrors, it can project your image onto a background and all you have to do is trace it. She was so scared. She thought it was black magic. And a lot of science years ago was thought of to be the work of devils and black magic because people didn't understand it. So when it comes to color theory and light, when we get into light and shadow and how light reacts, then it's definitely a lot of science in there. And this is not a science show. So I am going to minimize that and want to keep it more fun than scientific. So now I did my green, which was between the blue and the yellow. Now I'm going to work my way around, and my little 6 o'clock dot down here bubble is going to be orange. And it's going to take more yellow than red to make an orange that visually is halfway between red and yellow. So let's mix some of that up. And I'm just going to use a little red. And my red is very pink, very magenta. Use my brush and then dip it into the yellow. And I used a lot of yellow, and it's still not quite as yellow as I want. This is still looking like a reddish orange. I want to add a little bit more yellow, so I get a pumpkin color. Okay, now I got it. I probably used 3 times as much yellow as I did red to get this orange color, but that's a pleasing orange to me that visually appears as if it's halfway between the red and the yellow. And again, even though in our heads, we might say, oh yeah, I know that red and yellow make orange. Until you actually mix it, you don't really get a feel for the depth of the color or the intensity of your pigment. There are all kinds of color wheels that you can buy out there. I was looking for mine. Of course, I couldn't find it in time for class. But some of them are almost like a recipe where if you dial to the color, it has different movable circles with windows. If you dial to that color, it'll tell you how many parts red, how many parts yellow, how many parts blue. It's like a recipe. If you have a color printer and it breaks down into CMYK and you have a color and you click on the printer, it might show you that this particular purple is 58% blue and 40% red and 2% yellow, something like that.
Okay, so I replicate that, Katie, like like with just a brush. I mean,
Say
that's
that
where you
again?
say it gets to science. Well, isn't it hard? Like if you heard it was 58% this and 20% that, you're just kind of, but what most people would do, even using that recipe, is kind of estimate, like guesstimate it with their brush.
Yeah, eyeball it.
Yeah.
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 Yeah, it's usually broken down because I use it Adobe programs like Photoshop and InDesign, and they have the recipe in there, but that only works on my computer. I eyeball all my color mixing, but knowing full well that my yellow is my weakest and I'm going to need a whole lot more of that.
Yeah.
Now, when we come now to the blue and the red, which we're going to put up here in the 10 o'clock bubble to make purple. Purple is a fussy color to blend. As you can see on this other color wheel, my purple here is a deep, deep plum. So red and blue are the 2 most intense primaries. So when you add them together, they're going to make a dark color. So that's why I might add a little drop of white to show you how a white can create a tint, because this purple here is probably reading black across the video, across the Zoom. It's a super dark purple, but that is the unadulterated mix of blue and red. And I think I'm going to use more red than blue because my red is weak here. The blue seems like it's a more intense color.
Yeah, I've never been able to make purple mixing it myself.
Yeah, purple is a challenging color. That's why so many people prefer to buy it. It's just easier to buy. Now, I just did a tiny drop of blue in a big glob of the red, and I'm still getting a very dark grape. But it's not as dark as my other sample. I'll bring this up to the screen in a minute. But it's still a very dark purple, as you can see right here. That's just mixing the blue and the red together. But what I want to do now is, before I do my other wheel over here, which won't be pure pigment, because now I'm adding a little drop of white because I want to make that purple a little lighter. I always have a pair of pliers around because a lot of my paint tubes sometimes get stuck, and pliers always seem to get them unstuck. So I'm going to take out a tiny little bit of white. And when we add white to something, we are creating a tint. And we'll get into tints more when we talk about values and intensity and saturation of color. But right now, I'm going to wipe my brush off and add just a little white to this purple and see if I can lighten it up a little. I don't want something super light, like a pastel lilac but I want something just a little lighter so I can read that it's a purple. See, and adding just a little drop of white gives me a more recognizable purple color and not like that midnight purple that I was getting, that super dark, it's like a Concord grape. And when you add white paint to something, it makes it a little bit more opaque. So if you're sometimes frustrated that you're getting see-through, because see here on my yellow, you can see the letter Y that I sketched in that circle. This yellow is very transparent. If I want to make this yellow more opaque, I would add white paint to it. And it helps make it more opaque instead of translucent. Sure, my
So opaque means, I mean, I always get confused with what that word means. It means you can't see through it.
Yes, opaque means you cannot see through it. That it's not transparent. It's like the difference between pantyhose and tights. Pantyhose are sheer and transparent. You can see every one of my leg veins. But when I wear opaque tights, you don't see it. It's covered up. So I'm now going to I added just a little bit of white to the yellow paint. And it still reads yellow. It's not a pastel yellow or like a baby color, but now you can no longer see the Y. It is all covered up with paint because that adding white paint to it made it more transparent.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Do you always mix your colors with a paintbrush?
You
or
can.
do you ever use like a popsicle stick?
You can use a popsicle stick. You can also use a paint knife, like a palette knife or a paint knife like that, and to mix it back and forth. I'm using a brush today because I'm using these little wells, and I'm using
Sure.
a smaller brush. I don't know what this is, maybe an 8 or a 10. It's covered up, whatever size it is. And this is a bright, which is a flat brush with short bristles.
Thank you.
And I'm using just a little area. If I would, when I'm using much thicker paint and I'm mixing my paints on palette paper, like on this slick waxy palette paper, and if I'm applying thick, big strokes of paint, I would use a knife and mix it with a knife, back and forth, mixing the color.
Hey, Katie?
Yeah.
Oh, hi, I'm sorry. I just have another question. If you're mixing the blue and the yellow to get green, could you add a little white in that too to get
Yes.
a little?
Yes, what I'll do, I'll demonstrate that now because I have some of this green left in my
Thank you.
palette, and I'm going to add just a little drop of white. And when I'm barely letting it bubble up out of the tube. I'm taking just a little, like less than what you would use for toothpaste. And I'm just picking up the little dollop of white, and I'm going to mix it into the green and back and forth, and it will lighten it up. And it's better to add a little bit at a time. If you add too much white ink, white paint, you'll end up with a pale mint color. It's easier to keep adding more white than it is if it's too light. And then you have to go add more of the green again, and you don't really want to add black because that adulterates the green. So what I'm going to do now is just go over this screen here. It is a little bit lighter, but not terribly lighter. You know, not so it's like a mint color. It's more like a pine tree color.
Did not get your purple. I still have like a grape, not grape, like it looks like boysenberry ice cream or something.
Yes,
I can't get it that bright.
purple is a difficult color for all artists to mix. That's why many artists buy purple tubes of paint pre-mixed in the shade that they like, because it is a pain to make your own. It's more difficult to make purples you like than it is to make greens you like. I know many, many landscape painters who don't buy green paint. They prefer to mix their own greens with various shades of blue and yellow. So now we have covered our first tier. We've got our primary blue, red, and yellow. We have our secondary colors, which are green, orange, and purple. Now we have another tier of colors called our tertiary colors. And those would be the colors in between. Between blue and green, you have blue-green. Between green and yellow, you have yellow-green, which is kind of, limey. Between yellow and orange, you have yellow-orange. Between orange and red, you'll have reddish orange. Between red and purple, you'll have a reddish purple. And between purple and blue, you'll have purplish blue. Now these we're going to mix starting with the blue-green at the top, like the 1 o'clock zone. And again, you might want, if the color is reading super dark, you might want to add just a tad of white paint to it to brighten it so it's not reading so dark. Acrylic paint, when it's dried, it tends to read darker than as it appears when it's wet, which is just the opposite of watercolor. When watercolor is wet, then it dries about 30% lighter than it appears when it's wet. Acrylic is the opposite. It dries and it appears darker. So this grapey color that I have here is wet. When it dries, it's almost black. It's so dark because acrylic paint dries darker. So what I'm going to do now is mix my blue-green. I'm going to put and I probably will add a little bit more green and just a little bit of blue, because the blue can be overpowering. And equal amounts of pigment does not mean that the shade is equally between the two colors you just mixed. I hope that makes sense. It sounded like a mouthful. And I'm again wiping off my brush on a scrap piece of paper that will be something I'll use for the future, maybe a collage or something. Adding just a little white. I might need a little bit more blue. So you'll see it's a back and forth process. This blue-green that you're creating is like an ocean kind of color, the kind of colors that you might see if you were doing a seascape. It's a dark aqua. Oh, I like this. I'm going to add a little bit of white to it to brighten it up, so you'll be able to see it better across the monitor. And it does take a couple minutes of mixing the color, pulling it back, squinting, looking at it up close, looking at it far away, and the way it might appear on your palette. You might be using a white plastic palette or a piece of clear glass or plexiglass or paper. It will appear different on your palette than it will when it's dried on the piece of paper. So the surface has something to do with it also. I need a little bit more white. Another piece of scrap. And it's a pretty color. Add a little bit of white to it. I thought about using a couple different brushes because I'm constantly cleaning this brush, but it's been my experience in the past that if I have a couple different brushes going, then I have a greater possibility of getting them mixed up and putting my purple brush into the green. Okay, so I've got a nice teal going on here. I don't know if you can see that teal color, but I'm going to put it right between. And I don't like that small circle for the tertiary. I'm making it bigger. And this is even with a little drop of white in it, and it's still pretty dark, but it's a dark aqua. And that would be a good mix. For kind of tropical paintings. Clean my brush. And I'm just going to be making marks on the paper, trying to scrape the brush off and get this off my brush, just making swirly marks. And where you see it, that is the dry brush, where it makes that rough surface texture. Okay, so that is my teal. Now I'm going to mix my green with my yellow, and I'm going to try and get like a limey yellow green. Again, a nice tropical Florida kind of color. So I need to mix green, take my green and add a lot more yellow to it. So I got to squeeze out more yellow. I've used, of the 3 dollops I initially squeezed out. I still have a lot of blue yet left. The blue is so intense, I haven't had to use a lot of it. The yellow, I'm using a lot of. So now I'm going to make my yellow green. I need a lot of yellow for this. Add just a little white to it again, just to brighten it up a little so it presents better, gets my point across. So now if you're ever in a setting, if you're, taking a museum tour or something and people throw words around like tertiary colors, you know what they're talking about. It's like the 3rd level of color mixing. So I've got my yellowish green here. It's like a lime. I've got my yellow green here between my green and my yellow. And even though this is kind of a science-based exercise, you're tweaking it with your eyeball and your observation, saying, I think it needs a little bit more yellow, or I think it's too blue. You're bringing your assessment to it. Now I'm going to rinse my brush off again, and I'm going to go for that color between yellow and orange. And I know I'm going to need more yellow than orange. So I'm just going to use a little bit of orange and more yellow, because we know that equal amounts will not give us the color we want, that we need more yellow to achieve it. And this is how you get to know color, by mixing it. If you have a wide range of colors available at your disposal, at your home there, wherever you're working, I would fool around with mixing more together, because after we finish this, and I see my time is, I hope you all can stay a couple minutes over, because there's one more thing I want to do about color. And again, this is pretty transparent. I've got my yellow orange, but see, it's so transparent, you can see the printed black circle under it. I did not add a lot of white to that. So now I'm going to make my orange red. So I've got this orange that I created. I'm going to add just a little bit more red to it to get an orange red for that color. And this is how many design houses come up with color trends or color stories for lines of clothing or shades of, like Benjamin Moore interior paint colors, is they mix them together to find new and interesting combinations. So I'm going for the orange red now. So let me take a little bit of red add it to a little bit of orange. If you think your paints are drying up, you can always give them a little spritz with the spray bottle. Ooh, this is a pretty color. It's red orange. It's like, reminds me of is it a camellia I'm thinking of? Like, I don't know. But that's a pretty color. So I'm going to put my red orange right in this circle. And it's funny, it looks different on the paper than it does on the palette. Oh, I forgot to do this one. This is also not very opaque. Okay, and I've got two more circles. Now I'm going to do my red purple little bubble in the 9 o'clock area.
Purple and red, huh?
Yeah, purple and red. That's going to come out dark, so I'm going to try and add a little white to it.
Every time I've added white to try to help with the opaqueness, I've lost kind of the beautiful color I
Well,
created.
that's what happens. It does get a little bit washed out,
Yeah,
opacified, if that's such a
Yeah.
word.
yeah. My beautiful summer green turned a little mintier than I would like.
So that's, that's how we get to know color,
Yeah.
doing it.
Yeah.
And along with sometimes when we might not mix the desired result, we might also stumble across a result that does surprise us that we weren't expecting.
Yeah.
There's so many combinations of color to make. It's endless. It's really endless. So I think I've got a purpley red here. It kind of looks like the other purpley. Maybe I need a little bit more red. Yeah, that red was kind of transparent because I could see the R on the paper underneath. If you get paints that are, I would say don't despair if your paint is transparent. If the paint is super opaque, that means it has a lot of filler in it. So we really don't want a lot of filler in our paint. We don't want a lot of chalk. The less expensive paints, you'll find a lot of filler, like the craft paint will have be chalky and opaque. It might suit your purposes for certain projects. I know if I do jelly press painting or mixed media, I like to use the craft paints because they're opaque and they have a lot of filler, and they are often less expensive. All right, I'm still adding more red because I put my red purple next to the purple and it's more purple than red. And it looks different on the paper than it does on my palette. So even the teacher struggles. Okay. Okay. That's so crazy how they look so different on the paper. Okay, and my last one will be the purple blue combo. And I do have on my palette some leftover paint that I'm going to demo on what we can do with that in just a minute. Okay, blue purple. That's the one I'm coming up with here, which is kind of like a hyacinth, not a hyacinth, a hydrangea color, I'm thinking. Maybe a little bit more. It looks really purple on my palette, and then I put it up on the paper and it read more blue. So the surface on which you apply the paint will also change how the color is seen. Yeah, I like that color. That's a nice, that's like a periwinkle. I like that. So I have my, bring this up here. I've got my blue, I've got my purple, and in between I have this like periwinkle color. So when I mentioned before that we can create a darker color by adding black, that is not always the desired result. And what I wanted to show you here, if you have paint left over, I did all my colors and I stroked them out in a diagonal fashion. And then when they were dry, I used up my white and black paints over it so I could see how the white reacts on top of yellow. They're so light that they almost fade into each other, where the white against the dark background really pops. Same thing with the black. Black on yellow is a huge, strong combination, where black on blue, not so much, because the values are too similar. What I want to show you is, let me take a piece of paper. If you want to darken a color, you don't always have to do it by adding black. Sometimes that's not the way to go, especially if you're mixing greens. And because I love to do a lot of organic paintings and landscapes and flowers and things like that, I use a lot of green. If you want to darken a green, add a tiny, tiny bit of its opposite color. So the opposite color, and you'll be able to see it now that you have your color wheel, the opposite color of green is red. So if I want to darken this like lime green here, if I don't want to make it, darken it with black, I'm going to darken it with a tiny bit of red. And I'm going to show you, and I'm talking a tiny, because if you mix your opposite colors together, you're going to get a neutral. You're going to get browns and grays. And again, not all artists like to go out and buy a tube of gray paint or brown paint. They like to mix their own neutrals. So I'm going to take a tiny bit of red and add it to this green to show you how that green's going to change by putting the opposite color in there. And I think I need a little bit more, red. And it is a transparent red. That's why it's, I need a little more. The sun type. And it's better to add a little bit at a time and keep adding a little bit at a time. Because once you add it, you can't take it away. So now that I added this red, I'm getting like a brownish kind of green, like a khaki. I'm getting a khaki color. Which would be great in the landscape. See, it changed it from a lime green to like a khaki or an olive green by adding just a touch of the opposite color. And now I'm going to play with that. I think I'm going to add a little bit of blue to my orange, or orange to my blue, and see what happens there. You'll get a neutral happening there as well. So I got a little bit of blue. If you mix all the colors on your palette together now, you will get like a mud color, like a grayish brown. And some people call it mud, where I tend to like neutrals in that they great for shadows. And when we get into creating dimension and shadows and all that, I'll talk about that more. But even though I'm a person who really likes bright colors, I also really enjoy beautiful shades of different neutrals, different tans, different grays, different khaki colors. So adding orange to this blue has made a very greenish brown. And again, I'm taking a scrap and I'm making like a square of that color. And if I was really smart, I would label it. I would say, like purple plus lime green or something like that, which I have done in other areas. Like if you combine, this is ultramarine blue with Naples yellow, and I made a little square. And this is ultramarine blue with cadmium yellow, and that's the green. And this is Naples yellow and cadmium yellow. So I have a little recipe book, swatch book reference for if I want to mix that color again. But a fun way to use up the paint on your palette is to make a little patchwork sampler now of little color blocks. Oh, that's a pretty color. Little color blocks, and I'm just going to stack them, and then I'll have an interesting piece of paper that I can go on and use for a collage maybe in the future. I like doing a lot of painting with collage elements. And I'm thinking in the fall, I want to start teaching live again. I was supposed to this spring, but then, when we had to plan classes a few months ago, all those variants were attacking us. So they said, let's stay virtual. But in the fall, I want to go back to painting in live classes again. And there's a whole different vibe. Oh, I love that color green. That is a beautiful color green. And that's how I suggest you use up the color in your palette. I'm just making blocks of color that will come out looking like a patchwork quilt. Something like this, I would gather all my like greens in one area to affect like foliage, and all my pinks and purples do in other clusters to affect foliage. But all of these are done with scrap paint, with leftover paint, and just getting it down on paper in some fashion so I'm not flushing it down the drain. And this is what happens when you dip your brush into yellow paint and you still had green paint on your brush. I'm getting a really streaky block of color. And I will continue to use up the color on my my palette by creating these blocks, and I'll fill up my whole sheet and let it dry and think about what I'll do with it in the future. I have lots of these paintings squirreled away that I pull out for collage. And I do want to go, I haven't taught it in Scarsdale yet. I've taught it a lot in Chappaqua, painting with collage. And in the follow-up email, I'll send you an example. I don't have one at the ready here of a finished item, but
I would definitely take that, Katie. But do
it's
you
so
only do,
fun.
I can't remember when, because I definitely took some of your real life classes too. Are they all like middle of the day?
I usually do, I like 10 to 12.
Okay.
Because I travel from Mount Kisco, it's hard for me to do a 9 o'clock class in Scarsdale.
Yeah.
But at 10 o'clock, 10 to 12 is usually the time slot I like to do it, but it also depends on the availability. While we're finishing up here, let me grab something really, oh, that's okay, that wasn't bad. Oh, I'm just grabbing something really. All right, this is one that I just finished. This is painting in collage, and it's usually using collage elements and paint and photographs and tissue papers, and there's a lot of acrylic paint on here. I usually overpaint the faces, but I have fun doing these. And
Great.
sometimes students use photographs of family members or pets, and we make these outrageous and fun portraits. But you don't have to use a human figure. I have all kinds of examples where we have abstract paintings that use collage and acrylic paint, and they work really well together. So that brings us to a close. We went a little over time today. I also want to share with you, I want to send you a link because I got an email from the Mamaroneck Artists Guild. I am not a member, but I'm on their mailing list, and I recommend that you get on that mailing list, the email list of the Westchester Arts Council, and you'll get their weekly newsletter of what's going on in the county in terms of exhibitions, but also classes, free classes, exhibitions. But Mamaroneck Artists Guild, MAG, as they go by their anagram, they are having on May 15th, it's a Sunday from 1 to 3 p.m., it's an online demonstration from someone from the Golden Paint Factory who's demonstrating all these new products and how to use some of the things we talked about last week, like the different additives you can put on your paint. I'm going to forward to you. I'm going to figure out how to send, because I have to go through the Scarsdale portal, how to get this to you. because you have to sign up for it. It's free, but you just have to be able to let them know what your email link is so they can get you in on the online demonstration. But I'm looking forward to that because I love to see how paint manufacturers present their products and show you what you can do with them. So I think that that would be a worthwhile hour of my life.
What's the Westchester one called? Westchester?
I think it's Arts Westchester or Westchester Art Council. By the time I send you the follow-up class email, I'll have that too.
Thank you.
But yeah, you don't always have to join every art guild in order to get on their mailing list. And you don't have to be an artist to join a lot of these art guilds, but they, you know, they give you opportunities for exhibition and things like that. So I belong to a lot of them. It's a great way to socialize because as COVID hasn't taught us, it can be very isolating to be making your art all by yourself. Sometimes it's fun to just get out there with other artists, whether it's an urban sketchers group where you say, okay, we're going to all meet at you know, Lasden Park and we're going to sketch outdoors today. It's a nice way to socialize so you're not always isolated.
Yeah.
Are there any questions about today? I hope you had fun. I'm going to
Very fun.
send the email with links to a deeper dive into color, and we'll do a whole other chapter next week. So have a good week. I'll be in touch about what we're going to do next week. I haven't finalized it yet, but I don't think you'll need any more special materials. I think just the paint, a brush, some paper or some kind of substrate or surface, you're good to go. And we'll work more next week. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Have a great week.
Bye,
Yes.
everybody.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.